In this session, we're going to be looking at some things related to missionary work among the Native Americans. Particularly now, we are focusing on North America and Protestant missions. We had talked about Catholic missions to Native Americans in both South America and North America, particularly Mexico, which was New Spain, and New France, which today is Canada. And so today, we're predominantly looking at Protestant missions, which would have begun in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s is the time period we're largely looking at. Some things we'll talk about more when we get into the 19th century. And so our focus here is kind of prior to the formation of the United States. We're looking predominantly at the colonial period. Now, in some respects, I want to take a little bit of time and reflect on what Native American religion was like in North America prior to colonization, with the realization that there are a couple of things that are important to recognize, limitations that we have. First, that the general information that we have is very, very small. We'll talk about a little bit of written work that we have, but of course a lot of Native cultures prior to colonization and contact did not have a written language, so things were passed along orally. So often what we know about Native Americans is based off of archaeological information and information after contact, which means that a lot of the information that is available to researchers, historians, is not necessarily from a Native point of view. That information from a Native point of view is usually, of course, post-contact, so post-interactions between Native Americans and Europeans. So the other information we have is largely from Europeans who, understandably so, were predominantly antagonistic to Native religions. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. All of that means that in any sort of attempt to try and talk about Native American religion prior to colonization, we have very, very strong difficulties. And there are a lot of things that affect Native American religion, thinking about Native American religion, that we don't have in other cultures because of the issue of literacy. Now, I don't want to diminish the power of oral cultures in their transmission of myths, in transmission of important stories, history, etc. But again, the availability of those sources is shaped by that information of contact. So how much of a particular view is shaped by that experience of colonization. There are a couple of things, though, that we can relatively feel confident about what it was like prior to the encounter. One of the issues, of course, or one of the things, characteristics, is that Native cultures were very diverse. They were diverse in a couple of different ways. One was just the number of people that were there. It's estimated that there were about 15 million inhabitants of North America prior to colonization that were grouped in 550 different Native societies. Some of that we might call tribes, some of that we might call clans, but we're talking about a lot of diversity. There were 5 basic language groups in Native North America that we know about, but even within them there were distinct dialects that also reflected the differences that existed between natives. Despite the amount of diversity that existed in Native North America, there were some things that appear to be fairly common across different tribes and across different regions in North America. And so one of the things that I want to talk about here is trying to overlook the diversity and think about what were some commonalities. One common expression within Native American religion, apparently, was a notion of the importance of kinship as well as ideas of reciprocity. Kinship was understood in a couple of different ways. It was broader than just one's nuclear family or even extended family. That kinship would even be, a very extended notion of family as we would have it today. And beyond that, there was also a notion of kinship that was based on things like one's clan, things on one's tribe, where there might not be as direct of a blood relationship like what we think of when we talk about family or kinship today. And so there were definitely ideas of kinship that were broader than contemporary society, and kinship determined a lot of things related to things like your relationship to a different tribe, to a different clan, who your friends were, who your enemies were. Kinship was related to things like who you could marry, who you couldn't marry. So it covered a wide variety of aspects of life and not just an issue of who your parents were, who your grandparents were. Connected with kinship also appears to be understandings of reciprocity. That if I give you a gift, that puts us in a relationship where you're expected to reciprocate in kind. It's expected you would give me a gift. And so there's kind of this notion of sharing, of connections between people. And this, of course, becomes one of the ways in which there is a misunderstanding between Native Americans and Europeans, in that natives would give gifts to the Europeans, and the Europeans wouldn't necessarily respond in kind. Or the other way, Europeans would give gifts to Native Americans and kind of put them in a position of debt or owing the Europeans. So reciprocity becomes one of those things that Europeans exploited because the Native Americans didn't understand necessarily what was going on, nor did always the Europeans understand what was going on. And so there were expectations of what kind of relationships the two groups were in that led to a lot of misunderstanding. And then also it was not just a gift giving, of course, but it was also related to ideas of what was owed to certain groups. And so the idea of the elders are expected to care for the younger are expected to respect the elders. So there's these reciprocal relationships that existed within society that helped society maintain its cohesiveness. And to break down reciprocity was to break down society, which, of course, again, this is one of the things that becomes problematic with encounter. Also very important in Native American religions was the idea of ritual. Native American groups had their myths, had their stories about how the world was created, why the land looked the way it did, what kind of people they were, just like every other culture. Right? They're the stories that provide the shape for understanding who you are. But the myths themselves weren't, well, they were important, and it was important to pass them out. But when we think of, for example, from a Christian standpoint, the kind of things that are most important in Christianity, we think of perhaps the Bible and the narratives within the Bible, as well as certain beliefs. And so Christianity as a religion focuses on orthodoxy, having correct teaching. Native cultures, like many indigenous religions, the focus wasn't on the correct teachings as much as it was on the correct performance of rituals. And so ritual was much more of an important component of Native American religions than belief. And so it was important that you did the rituals in the right way. Now, depending on the tribe, some groups believed that you had to perform the rituals in an exact manner, just as it was handed down to you. That if you didn't perform them in the right way, then the intended outcome wasn't going to be necessarily assured. So if you were trying to connect with the holy people, for example, through a sand painting, like the Navajo would do, you're not, if you don't paint it the right way, maybe the holy people aren't going to do whatever, help with your crops or help with fertility or something like that. In other cases, in other tribes, you would have some opportunity for innovation, where you had the general guidelines, the general outline of the particular ritual, but there was the opportunity for you to perform that ritual by adding your own spin on it, let's say. So, for example, let's go back to the Navajo sand painting. If you were in a situation where you were sand painting, maybe the general sketch, so to speak, was given, but how the colors you used might be open to interpretation, or the particular figures included, right? So that would be a place where maybe there would be this allowance for innovation. But again, it's much more, the focus is much more on ritual than it is about having specific beliefs. Also apparent, and we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the Franciscans and Franciscan missions in New Spain, most native cultures had this idea of the contrasting forces of wholeness and chaos. Again, usually understood in the scope of these kind of circular circles of reality or society. Right, thinking of your tribe and the land where your tribe lived as a circle, and outside the circle are the forces of chaos. And so there was this constant struggle between maintaining the wholeness of the tribe and struggling against the chaos that threatened to overturn it. And we talked about how, again, this was exploited by the Franciscans. It would be, a problem with other Europeans as well, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally. But many of them had this notion of without the tribe's area, the land where you lived, were the forces of chaos. So for a lot of tribes, when the when the Europeans came, right, they're coming from outside. They are the forces of chaos, or at least they are connected with the forces of chaos. So that's something you needed to be concerned about because of what they were going to be doing to the tribe. Another important aspect of Native American experience that we need to recognize in any sort of discussion of missions is how quickly and how much the Native American population in the Americas decreased through the experience of encounter. And in many respects, we're talking about just a really sizable amount of death that took place after Europeans arrived. And if I were to ask you what were the 3 causes of mass death, probably most people would say, most people that have had some background in history would point to how much of an impact European diseases made on the native cultures. Predominantly, the main one was smallpox. Now, sometimes, there are stories that sometimes this was used intentionally to try and decrease the population, but even if it didn't happen intentionally, Native American health wasn't ready for smallpox. And so that led to a large number of deaths. Attempts at enslavement also led to a lot of death. We noted when we were talking briefly about slavery in a previous session how Native American enslavement wasn't a very successful attempt. that Native Americans were able to escape enslavement more easily than Africans were. And that's true, but that didn't mean that there wasn't any sort of enslavement that was attempted to take place. And often that did result in death for a lot of Native Americans, either through the conditions or people trying to run away, etc. And then the third major cause of mass death would have been violence or warfare sometimes between tribes, but also, I mean, predominantly we're talking about here between Europeans and Native Americans. I mean, certainly there was a lot of violence prior to contact. There is not a good historical evidence for the kind of peaceful native notion, like that prior to European contact, Native Americans lived in peace and everything was great, and the Europeans destroyed all that. No, there was a lot of violence among Native American tribes even prior to contact. But of course, you know, there were things that kind of prevented the extent of that violence, in that, you know, you do have this notion of reciprocity even between tribal enemies, and so there's still some consideration there that wasn't as much of an issue between the Europeans and the Native Americans when it came to violence and warfare. So the Native American population decreased very extensively as colonization continued. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about some specific missionaries to Native Americans, but I want to maybe ask a question first to kind of set the stage here. And one of the questions is, were missionaries successful? Did missionaries wind up converting Native Americans? Well, you know, it's difficult to say. Now, in many respects, when we talk about conversion and success in conversion, we are faced in a difficult position, because what do we mean by success? And in many cases, what we would mean by success is, did people preached to accept Jesus as the Son of God and respond appropriately and you know, respond in faith and convert? Well, when it comes to answering a question like that, we don't know. What we know is what is often what the missionaries said the natives said, but did those natives who told the missionaries that they believed that Jesus was the Son of God, perhaps they were baptized, they started attending church services, internally, in their hearts, in their minds, had they really converted? Well, there were probably some that did, and there were probably some that didn't. And those that didn't just claimed to convert in order to getting good with the Europeans, try to prevent persecution from the Europeans, there's all sorts of reasons that people would have feigned conversion. But that's not something we can figure out. All we know is based on what these missionary reports are at various times for various peoples and various groups, talking about some of these situations. And so there were probably some that converted fully, adopted Christianity, and then there were others that probably feigned conversion. But when it also came to mission strategies, in many cases there was an attempt, often we're talking about here Catholic more than Protestant missionaries attempt to find some sort of middle ground. Something that was not native religion, but we might say it's not quite Catholicism or even Protestantism. It's kind of like the taking of certain elements, like say certain elements of native rituals or the native calendar or words, and taking a little bit from Christianity and trying to find some sort of middle ground. So, for example, you know, a missionary that learns a native language and is trying to explain a theological concept, well, that native word might not fully convey the depth of European thinking about a specific concept, let's say like the sovereignty of God. And so you find this word, and it's like, well, okay, it's the closest word, you know, and so, you know, you try to use it. And the natives have one idea about what that word means, and Europeans have another idea about what they're trying to communicate. And so you end up more frequently with some notions of a hybrid type of movement, which is not fully European Catholicism, because there's been some compromise there, and it's certainly not Native American religion, because it's adopted a lot of things related to Christianity. So that often was the case. And sometimes, again, this was an intentional attempt by missionaries, and sometimes it developed as natives tried to take some things that the missionaries were telling them and try to hold on to other things that they particularly believed in. Another component in all of this is the ways in which the encounter between natives and Europeans put Europeans in a very difficult position, because there wasn't a clear approach or clear understanding of Native Americans. And so you get these views. On one hand, a lot of Europeans looked at Native Americans and looked at these people as they are noble innocents. Right? They're largely free from the taint of sin. They are childlike. They have simplistic ways and simplistic minds. And so, in one sense, there was this thought, okay, well, it'll be easy to convert them because they're not far from the attitudes and behaviors needed for the kingdom, right? And so they're like the little children that Jesus says are the ones that are going to enter the kingdom. And so on one hand, you have some people viewing natives like that. On the other hand, you have other people saying they're absolute heathens. They are absolute pagans. This is terrible and horrible, who they are, what they believe. You know, and so you have this ambiguity, because on the one hand, you have some people viewing natives as this noble savage, this idea of these childlike people who are close to the kingdom, and other people viewing it as these are people that have to be stopped, and we need to remove their rituals and get rid of all these other demonic types of things. And so there's a lot of unclear approaches here, where there's not a concise, cohesive view on who these people are and how to approach them. Furthermore, when it came to native rituals, and the Europeans looking at these native rituals and understanding these native rituals, there are different approaches that people are taking in thinking about these native rituals. For some people, they looked at certain rituals among certain groups and said, wow, there's a lot of similarities here to Christianity. You know, maybe a certain ritual that involved a meal. Right? And so they might say, okay, there's some similarities here between what they're doing and the Eucharist or communion. And so some people are seeing in these native rituals similarities to Christianity. Well, where do these come from? Why is there this similarity? So one view that some people developed was that Native Americans were actually lost tribes of Israel. And the reason they're similar to Christianity is that these are people that are descendants from the Israelites that had been lost, right? The Assyrian captivity, other types of the diaspora that had taken place with the Israelites, that's why there's similarity. Some people even went so far as to suggest that perhaps some apostles, like Andrew was one that was usually suggested, made it to the Americas, traveled to the Americas, which doesn't seem historically likely. But that was one view that some people had, was that maybe long ago the apostles, some of the apostles had made it to the Americas. And so some people had rather positive views towards native rituals, thinking that, okay, they started out, they were practicing Christianity, but over the centuries, without having the presence of the church and ministers and the scriptures, these practices, which were once originally Christian, gradually deteriorated over time. And that's why, obviously today, it's not Christian, but there's some similarities because these are holdovers from the past. Other people were not as kind towards native rituals. While some people thought them, it's a historical deterioration of Christian practices, other people thought, no, what these are is the devil has gotten to these people. And these practices, there are similarities, but they're essentially imitations from the devil that are, just kind of distortions of Christian practices. But the devil gave them to natives, perhaps to, curse their souls, to the kind of, the devil always does things that are distortions or mockery of, or mimicry of Christianity. And so some people believe, no, this is the devil at work here. And in many respects, there definitely was the notion of the ways in which a lot of Europeans believed that the devil was absolutely active in the New World. And when it came to this, there were a couple of ways in which the devil was active in the New World. For some people, it was a matter of looking at these behaviors and saying, what you have here is you have all these deities that they worship and all these other types of expressions of Christianity, of demons and spirit beings. So these must be the devil. Now, that becomes difficult for a lot of Native Americans because deities in Native American tribes were not usually wholly good or wholly evil. They were often either a mixture of both, or you had these tricksters who, attempt to cause trouble, but they're not totally evil. So Europeans come with this idea of, God and the devil, and being two distinct, separate, dichotomous beings, right? One wholly good, one wholly evil. And Native Americans don't fully grasp this. And so this was evidence of the devil, but then on the other hand, the Native Americans didn't really understand what you meant by the devil when you started talking about the devil. Another issue related to this was the way in which Europeans looked at these Native Americans who wanted to hold on to their sacrifices. A lot of natives, even those that were kind of beginning to think about Christianity, wanted to continue these practices, these sacrifices. And the Europeans absolutely were like, this is the mark of the devil, that they're trying to continue to hold these sacrifices. Now, sometimes, another way we see demonology, devilology in the encounter is the way in which certain native peoples would knowingly invoke the devil to kind of, goad the Europeans, right? Oh yeah, we worship the devil. Absolutely. That's us, right? Just kind of, get at the European. right? They didn't. They weren't directly worshiping the devil. Now, in some sense, can we say, yes, from a Christian standpoint, anything that is not of God is of Satan, or is influenced by Satan. So was there some sort of influence? Yes. But the natives weren't Satan worshipers in the sense of they were worshiping the devil, but they would some people would sometimes use that just because they knew how much it would disturb the Europeans to hear them saying, yes, we worship the devil. And so that became another aspect of this. And ultimately, we have to think about, in this encounter, that a lot of Europeans really believed that that demons were very much real and very much active. Today, within Christian groups, there are some groups that believe the demons are still very active, some that would really identify a lot of action to devils and to demons, right? Others might say, yes, there are spiritual forces of wickedness at work here, and we don't always understand it, but not everything is, everything bad is not due to a demon, right? If my car doesn't start, it's not because there's a demon preventing my car from starting, right? So you kind of have that kind of middle ground, and then you have some people who might be Christian, but don't really think of any sort of spiritual wickedness at work beyond the temptation to sin, right? And so we might say, okay, the temptation to sin is demonic or is from the devil, but other types of things are not demonic influence. So you have this kind of spectrum, continuum of different views on this subject. But for the Europeans at the time, demons were very real, demons were very active, and they would kind of be on the side of, a demon's around every corner, demons responsible for just about a lot of things. And so this, that was reflected in how a lot of Europeans viewed native society. And which, of course, if you're assuming, right, you're coming over here, there's imperial ambitions, there's economic ambitions, but then you also have people who are wanting to convert. And it's not a situation of, these are people that have ignorance and they need to be brought to the truth. These are people that are demonic. They are absolutely, fully under the power of the devil. Right? Well, that might skew a little bit of your view of, who these people are. And again, from a Christian standpoint, yes. If someone is not supporting God, they are under the auspices of the devil. I don't mean to say that they're necessarily antagonistic, but they're kind of in the world, and the world is controlled by the devil. That I don't mean to say that these people are evil, etc. But if they are not on God's side, they do have this being under the rule of the devil. So yes, we recognize that, but to trying to go into a place and you think of not just this is a section of place, this is a place where Christ is not conquered, but that the people that you are going to are essentially demonic. That really changes how you approach people from the standpoint of mission activity. I want to kind of put this into perspective from looking at a couple of things related to the Iroquois. Just highlight a couple things with the Iroquois, and then we'll move on to talking about some mission work among the Iroquois. A couple of things that I want to share with you about Iroquois religion prior to contact that I think shows about society. And then I also want to talk a little bit about a particular individual who was Iroquois but converted to Catholicism. Just briefly touch on her life, just to kind of give you an idea about some of these things. So one of the practices of the Iroquois that was present prior to contact was the dream guessing rite. This appears to be a ritual that was prior to contact and something that we don't really see a lot of Christian influence. There's other things that we see where we can definitely say, okay, this is influenced by Christianity, and we'll talk about one of those here in a minute. But the dream guessing rite appears to be one that was predominantly something prior to colonization. Essentially, the idea was that when you had dreams, these were desires, and often they were understood as personal desires, or they could be desires expressed from the spirit world. But the frustration of desire to the Iroquois was evil. And so it's important to understand this concept that if you frustrate desire, you prevent desires from being fulfilled, you are permitting evil. So if you have these dreams are desires of your soul, or they are expressions of the desires of spiritual beings, and to prevent them from being fulfilled was dangerous. So you would engage in this practice of the dream guessing rite. Now, often there was a specific season, a specific part of the calendar where this took place, but sometimes it could be done throughout the year as well. But you couldn't just come out and say what your dream was, right? I dreamed I got a new knife, so give me a new knife. You couldn't do that. Instead, you had to reenact your dream, or pantomime your dream, or even offer riddles. And so you offer a riddle, or you act something out, and people would then try to guess. So, for example, according to some of the Jesuit missionaries among the Iroquois, this is, I believe, this is one of the riddles that they heard. What I desire contains a lake within itself. Right? What I desire contains a lake within itself. And the answer is a pumpkin or a calabash, right? Because of the liquid or the liquidy stuff within the pumpkin or the calabash. And so you couldn't just come out, I dreamed I had a pumpkin, right? And you had to kind of ask these riddles. And then other people would be expected to guess, try to figure out the riddle, and then once the riddle was figured out, then fulfill it. Right? So giving you a pumpkin or a calabash or beads or something like that. Now, obviously, all dreams are not positive dreams, so what about those nightmares or negative dreams? Let's say you dream that your daughter dies, that she drowns. Sometimes it was believed that just the preparation to see the dream fulfilled was enough. So if you dreamt that your daughter drowned in the lake, and you kind of reenact that, and people figure out what it is, sticking your daughter in a boat on the lake, or a canoe on the lake, that would be sufficient. She wouldn't actually have to drown. It would be a way to prevent that negative dream from taking place. Same kind of thing with something like torture by your enemies. Maybe you would enact that, and then you would be tortured in effigy, right? You create an effigy of you, and that's tortured, right? And people take torches and burn the effigy. Or maybe even they might torture you with the idea that your friends, your family, your kinship group is going to torture you less than what your enemies would do. Let's say, the Huron, for example. The Huron, they capture an Iroquois, they're going to torture them pretty bad. Hey, it's still torture, yes, but the idea is that it's going to be less than what it would be than otherwise. So what you see here is this kind of importance of the individual, but also importance of the group, reciprocity. And while you might be getting the new knife or the new calabash, at some point you were going to be the one giving a new knife or a new calabash or something else, right? So the group here is connected as well as the individual. Another aspect of pre-contact religion that suggests things about Iroquois is present in the myth of the Three Sisters. The myth of the Three Sisters essentially is based off of the creation myth of the Iroquois. Sky Woman falls from the sky through a hole in the sky, and as she's falling to earth, the animals bring up land, from the waters, right, the primordial waters. There is no land, it's just waters. And so the animals, dig up land, create land for her to fall on, and Turtle says, well, I'll hold it on my back so it doesn't sink back into the waters. Sky Woman lands on the earth, she's pregnant, she gives birth, and then that daughter gives birth, and from her grave, the daughter dies while giving birth to twin sons. And from her grave sprout the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And there's a couple of things that this tells us. First of all, is the importance of women in kinship. That the Iroquois had matrilineal societies. Now, that doesn't mean matriarchal. Matriarchal societies would be where the women ruled. Matrilineal societies are instead the idea that you trace your kinship, you trace your ancestry through your mother rather than your father. So your closest male relative is your mother's brother. Right? So matrilineal versus matriarchal. There does not appear that there have been any major societies that have been matriarchal. There are some that have been discovered that are kind of close, but it's not been a very common expression. But matrilineality appears to have been common in some places, where your kinship is not traced through your father but through your mother. Additionally, the myth of the Three Sisters also emphasizes this connection between women, food, and soil for the Iroquois. However, that's also not to suggest, the women in Iroquois society did have some influence, right? And so the men would gather around the fire in a circle to discuss things related to the tribe. The women would gather in a larger circle around them, and it's kind of like, well, you in the inner circle better pay attention to what those in the outer circle are telling them, right? So yes, they don't have the full power, but there is a lot of influence there, and woe be the man who doesn't pay attention to what the women are saying. There were a variety of attempts of, now thinking post-contact, there were a variety of attempts at people trying to convert the Iroquois. It appears like that was more of a difficult proposition than maybe some other tribes. One of the major groups dealing with the Iroquois, of course, were those French Jesuits. And so the Jesuit relations focus a lot on Iroquois conversion attempts. It was a very difficult time for those Jesuit missionaries. Just being in the Americas was problematic, but there were a lot of Jesuits that lost their lives to Iroquois conflict, to the Huron who were against the Iroquois, right? So there's all sorts of things that led to a lot of Jesuits dying, not a lot of success in some ways, in some places, with conversions. However, there still was an influence that gradually works its way into Iroquois culture, and today there are a lot of Iroquois that are Catholic, a lot that are Protestant, there are a lot that are Seventh-day Adventist as well. But there were other ways in which you see the influence of Christianity. One of those is the formation of the League of the Iroquois and the story of how that developed. Essentially, the form of the Iroquois story that is known is definitely one that has elements of Christianity in it. And so the main focus is on a man named Ganawida, who's known as the Peacemaker, who goes through the Iroquois territory to the different tribes. And the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Mohawks, and he goes through these different tribes and brings them together into this, the five tribes of the Iroquois. The Senecas are in there as well, and the story is how the Ganowida becomes the peacemaker and brings these 5 tribes into the 5 nations of the Iroquois. The peacemaker, though, is born of a virgin. He goes out speaking and preaching. He faces doubt and jealousy by the prophets of his own country. So, there's a variety of ways here which the peacemaker sounds like it's got elements of Jesus in it. And so, there's definitely a way of this League of the Iroquois story brings together both Iroquois elements, because you got the 5 tribes, and then there's a lot of references to different elements of Iroquois myth, and then some Christian views. And largely the myth is to try and talk about how these tribes, these clans, are linked together through this tribe of the Iroquois. So it does suggest that there are some elements that make it into Iroquois religion after contact that reflect the influence of Christianity. Now, some people, though, did become Christian. One example of this is a woman named Kateri Tekakwitha. Tekakwitha is her native name. She is a Mohawk, one of the tribes of the Iroquois. When she becomes a Catholic, she takes the name Catherine, or Kateri, as her baptismal name. And so Kateri Tekakwitha. At a relatively early age, Tekakwitha lost her family to smallpox. She is raised by her uncle. She doesn't die in the smallpox epidemic, but her face is marked by the disease. She's raised by her uncle, but at some point she comes under the influence of the Jesuits, eventually becoming baptized. And that's when she takes the name Kateri, and then kind of decides to take on the religious life and becomes a nun. She was known, again, you can see from the dates, that she doesn't live too long. She doesn't have a very long life, 24 years, but her life as a nun was one marked by intense devotionalism. She would walk in the snow with barefoot, to prayers, other types of things. And so she was known as having a very religious life, a life of deep piety, and was well respected by the natives in by the Jesuits and by some natives. She was, after her death, she became a Catholic saint. She was beatified. That's the first step to sainthood in 1980, and is canonized, becomes a saint in 2012. Now, to become a saint, the process involves the investigation of 2 claims of miracles. And what were the miracles connected with Kateri? Well, one was a boy in the 18th century was supposedly healed by a piece of Kateri's coffin. Right? And so you have this healing cure, and there's belief that, okay, this is the first miracle. There are other places, other claims of healing cures but there's, the Catholic Church investigates and they're not too sure about that, so there's that one there in the 18th century. And then in 2006, a boy in Washington State survives a flesh-eating bacteria. Right, so he gets this flesh-eating bacteria. And so his parents are told, essentially, he's going to die. So the boy's half Indian, and so the parents pray to Kateri and ask her to heal him. And supposedly a bone fragment of hers, one of these relics, was placed beside him, and the infection stopped progressing and actually turned around and he got better. Right. So this was the second miracle that the Catholic Church felt was confirmed, Kateri's sainthood. And so she is sainted, canonized in 2012. So, this kind of gives you an idea of the experience of Native Americans in all of this, the struggles that Europeans were having with natives, and so all sorts of things wrapped up here. I do want to close this session by talking about three different missionaries, predominantly Protestant missionaries. Kateri, of course, is a Catholic, and we've talked about Catholicism, but I want to focus on three prominent missionaries. Now, when the English, for example, came to the United States, the political documents shaping, what they were doing and where they were going, included statements about the spread of Christianity, the conversion of Native Americans as being part of the colonial enterprise. Probably some of that was empty language, right? In that, the people that are drawing up these documents probably thought, this is a good idea, we should do this. The people that were coming over, Jamestown, doesn't seem like there was much interest in this. Massachusetts Bay, a little bit more interest, right? So depending on the colony, depending on the group, the company, right, there's more or less interest. Which meant that missionaries often found themselves in a very difficult position because they faced opposition from their own countrymen sometimes, and not just the natives they were trying to convert. That some English, some other Protestants didn't like the idea of converting Native Americans, didn't think it was that important, or that if they converted the Native Americans, they wouldn't be able to exploit them anymore, right? And so there's this struggling between, some of the leaders that are coming over for economic gain, and then some of the missionaries that are coming over as well. Additionally, especially in Native America, in New England, not Native America, in New England, ministers of congregations were also expected to evangelize the Indians. Right? And so in New England it was, okay, you're going to pastor this church or these two churches, and you're also supposed to evangelize the Indians in the area. Well, often, out of all that, the Indians were the ones that were neglected, not the churches. A couple of missionaries, though, did make efforts to reach out to the Native Americans at the time to various levels of success. One of those is John Eliot. Eliot has been referred to as the apostle to the Indians, one of the first ones to really kind of make an effort to evangelize Native Americans in this time period. And so Eliot was born in England, graduated from Cambridge, and he was kind of ordained to be a priest, but in the Anglican Church, but he's kind of a dissenter as well. So, he's not totally an Anglican priest. He travels to Massachusetts in 1631. His family would follow after. He becomes minister of the church in Roxbury, which was close to Boston, about 2 miles from Boston. The people in Roxbury had a relatively peaceful relationship. The natives were mostly ignored by the people in the town, and so there really wasn't, it wasn't a violent relationship, but there wasn't really much thought for the natives. So if natives come through town, it's just like, okay, whatever. In 1644, though, when Eliot is in his early 40s, he begins to consider, here are these people that need to hear the message of the gospel. And so he decides he's going to begin sharing the message of Christ with them. It's not, you know, some sort of Macedonian call. It's not any sort of feeling that he has as far as like being called to do this. It's just, hey, these are people that need to hear the gospel. So he studies the language. The people around him, the Algonquin language is predominantly the one. So he begins studying it. He's aided by a captive from the Pequot War. Remember, it took place in 1637. Algonquin is an oral language. It's not a written one. So that makes it difficult for a lot of Europeans to learn. But he continues to push at it to try and learn the language of the people so he can speak to them in their own language. So he delivers his first sermon in 1646. As he begins preaching, you know, that first sermon, very little response, doesn't seem to be any interest. Preaches again a month later. After he's done preaching, there's some attendees that stay. They ask some questions, right? So maybe there's some interest here. He also kind of started passing out treats or passing out gifts. You know, that might be apples or to like the kids, or tobacco to the parents or the men. You know, he seems to that kind of develops the idea of, well, I'll be teaching these children. I'll try to teach the children, and the parents will have brought them, and so the parents will start listening to what I'm teaching the children, and they'll become interested as well. So he returns a couple weeks later, and he has a class with the children, preaches a sermon, and this time, right, it seems like, okay, there's a little bit more interest. Some of the Indians actually kind of appearing to really listen to what's being said and appear to be moved by what's said. And eventually, some natives claim conversion. They begin making changes in their life. They start praying. They start keeping the Sabbath, Sabbath being Sunday for Puritans here. So they're following guidelines about Sunday. They give up some Indian rituals and customs. So there's this transition that appears to be taking among some of the people he's preaching to. Now, it appears that Eliot, as these people are kind of displaying their interests, talking about conversion, he delays baptism for them, and he even delays church membership. Right? So Puritan ideas were you baptize as infants. Then you would have a conversion experience later in life, where you were able to demonstrate that you were one of the elect, or that it was likely you were one of the elect. And then you would be voted on for church membership. And then once you were voted on for church membership, then you could take take communion. If you were a European, you would be able to vote in governmental elections, etc. Well, Eliot's kind of delaying some of that. Delaying the baptism, delaying church membership, because he wants to make sure that individuals are really committed in their faith before, you know, really kind of saying, okay, you're a member of the church, we'll baptize you, etc. He also develops the idea, he starts referring to some of these converts as praying Indians, and so he decides he wants to develop these praying towns. Essentially, the idea would be that these would be places for these Christian Indians that would be separate from other natives that are maybe not interested in the message or not displaying any interest in Christianity. And so you kind of separate natives from, that are converting, from non-converts. Sometimes putting them very close to Europeans, or even in European towns or sections related to those towns. These praying towns tended to be mixtures of native and European culture. So you got streets and you got lots, much more in English type of view, some English-style buildings, European-style buildings, but the homes that natives lived in were more traditional huts or things like that. Additionally, there was the setup of a local government that was more European, more English. Ultimately, Eliot kind of believes these praying Indians need to adopt European culture because of the connection for a lot of Europeans between European culture and Christianity. It's both. Right? Civilization is European customs and Christianity. Some whites, some English didn't like the presence of natives in their towns or near their towns. So you have opposition even from Christians over these converts. Eliot, like a lot of other missionaries, would begin a process of translating the scriptures, other types of religious documents into Algonquin. In 1655, he completes a translation of Genesis and one of Matthew, publishes both of those. By 1666, he's translated the whole New Testament. By 1663, the Old Testament is completed. He faces opposition even on this because some people feel you should be teaching the natives English rather than trying to continue the language, their language. He would go on to train Indians to be evangelists. Churches start ordaining Indians as ministers. But a lot of the efforts of Eliot come to an end with King Philip's War. So when Metacom begins his actions against the Puritans there in Massachusetts Bay, the praying Indians sided with the colonists. They sided with the Europeans. Now, it's not that they fully agreed with the Europeans. A lot of the things that Metacom had a problem with, the praying Indians did too. But they're siding with the colonists. Well, even though these praying Indians are on the side of the colonists, many of them, hundreds, are exiled from their praying towns anyway, and they're put in places where the conditions are terrible, and so that this devastates Indian culture. The King Philip's War devastates Indian culture, devastates these praying Indians, and devastates Eliot's work. And we talked about in a previous session the impact it had on families, etc. Another important missionary to Native Americans in New England was Jonathan Edwards. Now, Edwards we often think of in terms of his work in theology, his work with the First Great Awakening and revivals, and he's referred to as America's greatest theologian. But for a time, he was also a missionary to the Indians. After he's fired from his first major work at Northampton, he passes the church at Northampton. He had been doing, some ministry work throughout his education, but Northampton is kind of his first major work. He kind of takes over after his grandfather dies. He had been helping his grandfather, but then his grandfather dies, and so he kind of becomes the main minister there. Well, 1750, troubles start developing between Northampton and Edwards, and they essentially fire him. So he looks around for other opportunities and begins working for a small congregation, and he also begins evangelizing the Indians, particularly the Mohican and Mohawk. Now, he too faces opposition from local landowners because of some of the efforts he's doing with his missionary work. Some of those local landowners are related to people at Northampton who had a problem with Edwards that led to his firing. So, some of this might be, prejudice towards Native Americans. Some of this might be, we just don't like Jonathan Edwards. But he continues despite the opposition, and really his preaching to the Indians is very different from his preaching to others. And so, his sermons are recorded; they're still available. But when he, when he was preaching to English congregations, he had these statements of doctrine, and he developed these sections and all these. Well, he gets rid of that. He tended to be briefer in his sermons, tended to be more straightforward. There wasn't as much of a theological development. Some of this might be, because he's preaching to people that are not familiar with Scripture, scriptural teachings or doctrine or theology. And then also he has to preach through a translator. He doesn't know the language, so he's preaching through a translator, one who worked with David Brainerd, who we'll talk about here in a minute. So, that makes it more difficult. It's not as easy to preach through a translator. His experience with the Native Americans does lead Edwards to become critical of how Europeans were treating natives. And so he kind of condemns the French and the Dutch and even the English. But he also kind of, as a lot of Europeans and a lot of European missionaries did, has rather a paternalistic view of the Indians. He doesn't view them as equals. And so there's paternalism there as well. He's there for about 7 years before he accepts a position to become president of the College of New Jersey. The College of New Jersey would eventually become Princeton. And he's only there a very brief time before he passes away. Smallpox outbreak takes place. He decides to get the inoculation. There's something wrong with the inoculation, and so he ends up dying from not from smallpox technically, but the smallpox inoculation. So kind of smallpox. So again, this is a part of Edwards' life we don't really think about too much. And it's not obviously something we talked about in Survey Church history either. One of the most famous missionaries, perhaps after John Eliot, in this 18th century period is David Brainerd. Brainerd was born in 1718 to a wealthy family in Connecticut. But, he had a lot of difficulties in his life, personality-wise, psychologically. He suffers from depression a lot. His father died when he was 8. His mother dies when he is 14. So his young childhood is marked by a lot of tragedy. He will go on to study in Yale to become a minister. Enters there in 1739. And there's not, at the time, Yale is not a very, it's more Unitarian, it's more, it's less orthodox. But then Great Awakening happens, George Whitefield comes through, and it makes an impact on the school. And so there's a revival in the school, people starting prayer groups, other types of religious organizations, a lot of the administration, who is this more Unitarian, more, they don't like the emotionalism of the Awakening, and so they're very concerned about the enthusiasm that's taking place. Well, Brainerd, caught up in all this, makes a comment at some point that one of the tutors that he had has, quote, no more grace than a chair. And, well, he's kind of ordered to publicly apologize. He refuses, and so he's expelled from Yale. He begins to, he's kind of, all right, well, now what am I going to do, right? And I was trained to be a minister, etc. Well, he begins to consider missionary work among the Native Americans. He meets a minister connected with the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, kind of connected a little bit with the Anglican organization of a similar name. And so he's offered an appointment with this group as a missionary to the Native Americans. So he starts work among natives in the Bay Colony there. He's kind of assigned to work there. He was originally assigned to work with another missionary who has some experience, but Brainerd wants his independence, and so he really kind of goes off on his own. And he doesn't have much success at first. There's a lot of struggles he faces over his years in mission work. And so at first, some of that, of course, is Brainerd's desire for independence. He tries to preach without an interpreter very early on. He doesn't know the language. The natives don't really understand English that well, and so here's Brainerd trying to preach to the natives without an interpreter. He has other problems as well. He would get lost in places trying to find, the tribes. He would experience a variety of hardships. He would get sick. He gets wet from falling in a river. Right? There's all sorts of struggles that he faces. Now, during this time, there are churches, making offers to him of, come preach for us. But he decides, no, I'm going to continue in mission work, working with the Indians. Eventually moves from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania. He's received well by the Indians, but as he starts off, his interpreter, his Native American interpreter, has drinking problems. So that causes some problems. He's still not very successful, although he does eventually convert his interpreter. So he struggles there. He tries other places in Pennsylvania. He has to go through this dangerous terrain. His horse breaks a leg. Right? So there's all these problems. He continues to fight illness and depression. He feels guilty for his lack of success. But, he also has some, negative views of Native Americans. They're jealous, they're stupid, they're frivolous. They can't understand why heaven, or white heaven, is better than going to be with the ancestors. Right? So, he has some negative views of the natives that are kind of rejecting him. He hears that there are some natives in New Jersey that would be open to the message, so he goes to New Jersey, begins to have some success there, begins to see some revival among the Indians, kind of an Indian Great Awakening. And even some of the whites in the area are interested in the gospel. So revival starts taking place. There's similar types of emotional responses that whites were experiencing in the First Great Awakening, the later part of the 18th century. He convinces the group to settle in a new place. They establish a church. More revivals take place, but Brainerd's health begins to deteriorate, and he gets tuberculosis. He will travel to Northampton and in Massachusetts in the late 1740s and live with Jonathan Edwards. This is before Edwards is fired. Edwards' daughter, would take care of Brainerd. He has some interest in perhaps marrying her, but after a couple months, Brainerd dies from tuberculosis. A couple months after that, Edwards' daughter would also die from tuberculosis. Edwards would then edit and publish Brainerd's autobiography in 1749, so still before he is fired in Northampton. And it became a good seller. It had an impact on people reading about his life and the struggles in his attempt to spread the gospel. So that leads us to completing this part. We'll talk a little bit more in the 19th century about some mission work to Native Americans, but we're finishing up kind of the 18th century now. And we're going to see a big shift now as we begin to move on into the 19th century. Because really now, for Protestantism, the 19th century marks a great transition into interest in mission work and activity to mission work, especially from England and from the Americas. And so over the next couple of sessions, we'll look at this explosion that takes place in Protestant mission work. There's kind of a decrease in Catholic mission work at the time, and a lot of that has to do with how a lot of nations in Europe are becoming Protestant. The French Revolution takes place, so that separates France from the Catholic Church. So there's some struggles that Catholicism faces in that 19th century. And so there's a decline in Catholic missions at the time Protestants are beginning greater mission efforts. And we'll look at that in the next session.